Thank you for joining us tonight. We are so excited about our special guest and the topic, why multi-sport participation matters for every child. We're proud to feature Dr. Matthew Harris, therapy manager at Nemours Sports Medicine at Nemours Children's Health. We have an incredible topic tonight, but just first about tonight's session. You can see us, but we cannot see you. You're on mute, but please use the Q&A box to ask any questions you may have. Share your questions as they arise. We will do our best to address as many questions as time allows. This presentation is being recorded and will be emailed to enrolled families after tonight's event. So let's get started. I would like to introduce Dr. Matthew Harris. He is an expert in this field on tonight's topic, and he has an incredible background. Earned his doctorate of physical therapy from Thomas Jefferson University and practices at Nemours Children's Health, specializing in pediatric sports medicine. With a focus on managing and preventing overuse injuries in youth athletes, he frequently provides educational talks on injury prevention and the risks of early specialization. Matthew currently serves as the sports therapy manager at Nemours Children's Health, Chase Fieldhouse. Welcome, Doctor.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and this is a topic definitely near and dear to my heart. I talk a lot on this. I wish I didn't have to talk as much on it, but I like getting the word out there and talking about the importance that we see, and trying to educate families and everybody on what are the pitfalls when it comes to this kind of topic. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Doctor. Earlier, I shared with you, growing up, I had the opportunity to play multiple sports. I was a hockey player. I was nationally ranked in tennis and played the general standard sports, baseball, basketball, football up until like 8th grade. And I was fortunate enough to get a national ranking in tennis when I was about 13 and 14 years old. But as I went to nationals, I used to get absolutely demolished by these kids from Texas and California and Florida. I didn't have an opportunity to beat any of them as a young junior. And then it really wasn't until I was 17 and 18 and in college that I started to beat those top players in the nation. And I couldn't understand why. I was almost like second guessing myself. And it all came down to a couple things, which is why this topic is so important. And that was these kids I was playing, this is all they did year round was play tennis 3, 4, 5 hours a day. In the summer, 12 hours a day. And by the time I would play them as an older uh, junior or as a college student, they absolutely hated the sport. They were injured quite frankly, and quite frankly, they started to really hate their parents, which was really sad to see. And these were some of the top tennis talented players in the country. And so watching that, I really, reflecting back, go back to the fact that I was a multi-sport athlete, and that is really what allowed me to enjoy the sport I played. It allowed me to excel, and at the same time, it didn't allow me to get injured. And so I'm super excited about Dr. Harris's presentation tonight. Our agenda is really going to talk about a few items: the benefits of youth sports, the paradigm shift of youth sports, the growing trend and concerns with specialization, burnout and overuse injuries, athletic development, and physical literacy. And so without ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Harris.
Well, thank you for that intro. And again, I'm super happy to be here. This is great. Um, so like I said, I've talked about this many times with many families. So I often feel like I'm on repeat here with some of this, but it's a message that has to kind of get out. And it's one of the things that I'm very passionate about speaking about. So part of the reason I've been practicing for about 13 years as a PT, and part of the reason I do what I do is that I love youth sports. There's so many benefits that we have when it comes to youth sports. And we talk about a lot about the physical benefits, like we know, okay, better health and physical health and things like that. But really, we're starting to really kind of see the benefits from the mental and the psychosocial side, and that's really where a lot of the research has kind of gone, is into that bit of it. And one of the things that we're starting to actually look at is more of this longitudinally. So not just, hey, this is great, 5 years from now, what happens later in life for those kids that are participating in youth sports or youth activities? What does their life look like down the road? And what we're starting to see is some big things, so that we're starting to see, greater productivity at work. They may be, more, have a higher paying job. They're better health. They're not having depression and anxiety. In fact, those that participate in sports are less likely to have depression and anxiety, twice as less likely to have those kinds of mental conditions. So we're really starting to see this. And because of these benefits of youth sports has exploded, right? 60 million kids are participating in youth sports. That's a lot of kids, and that's constantly growing. Um, but unfortunately, we've kind of had this shift of sports. So really, we talk about sports and, a little history lesson. So back like 1920s, 30s, that's when scholastic sports really kind of started. And then after World War II, with the baby boomer generation in the 1950s and 60s, we had this kind of development of recreational sports. That's where Little League really started. And we started to have this kind of concept of recreational sports. And then another kind of explosion in the 70s with the emergence of Title IX and so forth. And it was really into the 1980s and the 1990s that we started to have this shift from participation in fun and fitness to one more focused on training and performance. And a lot of this has become those highly competitive leagues, and this pay to play model really started to emerge. Youth sports is about a $30 billion a year business. It's huge, and that's worldwide. There is a lot of money that is invested, not by just parents and athletes, but sponsors and so forth. There is a lot of money that goes around when it comes to youth sports. And because of this drive, we've kind of seen this emergence of what we call sports specialization. So what is sports specialization? Well, it's defined as year-round intensive training at a single sport. So we quit all other sports, we focus on one sport. And it's estimated that about 10 to 30% of youths in America specialize in, sports. And the mean age is about 12 to 14. And the big concern, and one of my biggest concerns when it comes to specialization, is that mean age is tending to trend earlier and earlier. And kids are tending to specialize in sports at ages 8, 9, 10, that we're starting to see this really, really emerge. And a lot of this is due to this drive to be a part of these highly competitive teams, to make it to college, and all these kinds of guidance that they're receiving, either from parents, coaches, etc., to really, really, you need to specialize. If you want to be good at soccer, you've got to play soccer year round, and that's what you got to do, because that's what's going to help you achieve your goals of soccer. And what we're finding out, that's really not the case. We're starting to see some actual concerns when it comes to specialization. And this is really where the studies and everything has really kind of, we've halted this kind of push, and we said, well, really, is this the best thing for us to be doing? And one of the reasons that we kind of started this is we're starting to see this decreased likelihood of lifelong athletic participation or participating in activity later in life. The Aspen Institute does a great job of researching these kinds of things. Their state of play report basically found that the average child quits after about 3 years, and most are quitting about age 11. So we're not getting this long-term physical benefit that we know exists from sports. We're well documented, but kids are not participating in it for longer periods of time. And part of that is this change in the way sports is. We're also starting to see, is there a potential increased risk for these overuse injuries in these specialized populations? And what is the effect that sports specialization has on overall athletic development? We think it's good, but is it really good? And that's where a lot of this research is really kind of emerging. It's really interesting for me, being a part in the medical community, going through some of this stuff and hearing from different people speak on this topic. So really, really interesting stuff when it comes to this. So talking about burnout, and we'll go from one extreme, that extreme of burnout. And really what burnout is we're talking about extreme tiredness, mental and physical, from working too much or trying too hard. And we talk about sports burnout, there's really three components that we really kind of highlight. We talk about the emotional and physical exhaustion. That's obvious. They're exhausted all the time, so many hours a week of doing the same things over and over again. They're just exhausted. This reduced level of accomplishment. They just don't feel like they're attaining that much. They're not meeting their goals, is what they say. And that really leads to that sport devaluation, whereas little Timmy loved baseball early on in his life, he just isn't so keen on it anymore. He may still enjoy it and goes and participates, but that glimmer in his eye, that really where he was running out of the car to go play baseball, it just might not be there anymore. And so those are the early signs of burnout. And so we've started to kind of take a look in this, and adolescents that have specialized in sports really have these three components when they kind of reach that burnout stage. So they're really attaining, and by doing too much, reaching burnout, these levels of burnout that are really unheard of, um, that we've really hadn't seen until we've started to see this emergence of sports specialization. And one of the other concerns that we have is overuse injuries. So I see a lot of this in the clinic. This is, a lot of what I see on a daily basis. About half of all pediatric and adolescent sports injuries are overuse injuries. That's a staggering number. And for if you're not familiar with an overuse injury is, in the simplest terms, it's essentially we're doing too much. The body is getting a load too heavy for the body to adapt to, and there's not enough rest to allow our bodies to adapt to the load that we're demanding on it. And that's really what kind of creates this kind of overuse injury. And it's these repetitive micro traumas essentially occurring at our bodies. And kids themselves, as a part of their normal development, are actually have an increased risk for overuse injuries. And so when we talk about like growth spurts and things like that, our bones and muscles grow at two different rates. Our bones go really, really fast. Our muscles not so much and lag behind. So we have this inherent tightness. And you can imagine putting a large load or a large workload on those muscles when they're already tight. You're just asking for something to happen. So really, really, really a lot of concern when it comes to this. And we're starting to see the evidence emerging saying that there might be a correlation between overuse and sports specialization. We're not strong enough to say, yes, one will definitely cause the other, but evidence is emerging that is stating that there is some concern here that those who specialize in sport are at a higher risk for overuse injuries.
Doctor, can I go one step further?
Yeah.
With that statement, would you also say when you compare that to multi-sport athletes, though, fall, winter, spring, summer, how would you say that, are you seeing as many overuse injuries there versus the one sport specialization year round?
Yeah, and that's really where we don't have the strong enough evidence to definitively say that. So, because overuse injuries are difficult to study in and of themselves, there's not a lot of data on the study of overuse injuries. It's very difficult to make that exact statement of, if you're a multi-sport athlete, you're going to have a less of a risk, but if you're a sports specialized athlete, you're going to have a higher risk. And we're starting to get there as we're going back through some of the studies and some of the longitudinal look that we're looking at, but we're not quite definitively there. But some of the evidence in these shorter, small studies is showing that this is kind of a little bit of concerning, some of the numbers that we're seeing and what some of the injuries that we're seeing. So while we can't definitively make that statement, we're leaning heavily on the fence of saying, yeah, this is probably going to be one of the ways we get. So we can't definitively make it yet, but we're getting pretty close.
Yeah, I think that the Aspen Institute a year ago came out with a study that stated that out of the top 100 NFL players that were drafted, 80% of them all played multi-sports growing up all the way through high school, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And so, we think about those athletes and those high level athletes, and we're saying, well, they must have played football year round. That's exactly how they got to the point. And that's been the kind of the myth that exists of that is that, what, to be a specialized athlete and to get the best athletic development, I have to participate in a single sport. And that's going to improve my performance later. And what we're really finding is that's not the case. You mentioned the study, Aspen Institute, yes. So 88%, and I'll go even further, that 90%, greater than 90% of the first round draft picks over the past 5 years were multi-sport athletes. You think about football athletes, cream of the crop, these guys are very, very athletic. So there might be something to say to that. I don't know how everyone feels about Tom Brady, but Tom Brady has been on, numerous platforms saying, what, I didn't play football until I was in high school. My parents forced me to play soccer, basketball, baseball, 3 sports all year round, a variety of different sports. I didn't specialize until I was in high school. Wayne Gretzky has even said, what, one of the worst things that's happened to youth hockey was year-round youth hockey. He said the kids that were really good at youth hockey were those that were playing lacrosse in the off season. So there is some anecdotal evidence that exists around this, and we're really starting to kind of really look at this in an evidence-based manner of, well, what really matters? And what we're seeing is this diversification actually improves overall skill development. And multi-sport participation aids in these concepts of long-term athletic development and physical literacy. And those are really, really important things. And the models we really are striving and pushing when we're talking about athletic development. Athletic development is an interesting thing in and of itself. So when we talk about athletic development, it's really a product of normal pediatric development. And so we could go long and long on this, and I'll kind of try and break it down in the simplest form. But when we think about it, and if you look at these charts, early on, we have a lot of central nervous system growth. We're getting a lot of neural networks. Our brain is constantly developing. In fact, most of our developmental milestones, those walking, crawling, and things, are done by age 3 to 5. That's the benchmark for them, right? Because we have this huge growth of the central nervous system early on. Now, we do have some physical growth, but we really hit that peak physical growth when hormones start to kick in, puberty, obviously. Okay, that's when we really start to see this rapid growth. And that's when we actually can really build muscle when we talk about it. You can't really build muscle in the absence of testosterone, which really doesn't emerge at a strong high levels until we hit puberty, right? So, but with that inherent huge growth in the physical stature, we also have changes in that body coordination. And so if you kind of look at it theoretically, when you talk about it, those kids that actually spent longer time, were those late bloomers in that neurodevelopmental stage, sometimes are the better athletes because of all the skill development they had in that neural period before compared to those, early bloomers who basically shot up, but they didn't have that time to develop all those skills. So by creating and getting a variety of skills early on in childhood and participating in a variety of sports, we really maximize that central nervous development, that neuromuscular network that actually helps with skill development later on. And so this is super important. And we're really finding that, hey, if we do more sports early on, we actually might be better off later on because the building blocks are all there and everything is created so that when we are at the point where we're really maturing and have stronger skeletal systems and all these things are in place, we're really able to maximize our athletic potential. And so that kid that may have peaked, early in late middle school, high school, compared to that late bloomer who has spent longer in that neural development period, actually might start to dip down comparatively to somebody who was a little bit later bloomer. And Michael, you talked about this a little bit. You started to see that kind of tail off. And part of that is, hey, I'm just done doing this. But maybe it was that, what? They didn't get a lot in that neural developmental period.
Yeah, absolutely. You could tell just from their attitude and their behavior and just their level of excitement about life as they were getting older. They were on top of the world, top five in the country. And then it's just really sad to see how that was their only identity and that was their only, and as they were excelling as a young junior, they were relying on that as their kind of kind of pedestal, and then as they were getting injured and losing, it really wiped out their identity and their self-confidence and self-esteem as they were getting older.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that really we want to try and avoid. We want to make sure that kids are enjoying sport and participating because we know the lifelong benefits of that. And that's really where this concept of physical literacy and long-term athletic development has really kind of hit home of this is what we really will actually want the model of physical and athletic development to really be. This is what we really should be striving for. And so physical literacy is kind of a term that gets loosely kind of thrown around there, but in the simplest form, what it really is you have basically this physical competence, the confidence, and the motivation to basically be able to participate in sport for life. And that's really kind of the cornerstone of things that we're trying to do. And when we talk about that, we're really talking about, um, you know, this concept of the ABCs or, agility, balance, coordination, and speed. So these are the building blocks of higher level skills. So much like the alphabet is the building block of words and reading and sounds and so forth, we learn all that in kindergarten and so forth. These simple movements and early on developmental skill can actually help later skill development. And when we think about reading, and my daughter's learning to read right now, she's in kindergarten. We're going through the sounds and everything like that. If I read her multiple books or if I'm reading her the same book over and over again, she's not getting different word sounds. She's not seeing different words. Okay. The same thing goes for the physical piece, right? The more exposure I get to different variety of movements, physical movements, the greater physical literacy I gain, the greater my developmental, my physical vocabulary really is later in life. Because I was doing different movements, different movement patterns, the ability for my brain and my body to adapt to skills and learn new skills is a lot better than those that are doing the same repetitive thing over and over and over again. And really, we're starting to see research this that where they've taken groups that were these sports specialized athletes compared to these multi-sport or sports sampling athletes, and they've had them do like a drop test. And a drop test basically jump off a box, see what their knees look like, and their and they're assessing their landing mechanics. And actually, the group that was sports specialized, they found actually were having worse landing mechanics. So they had this, their knees collapsing in, which basically is a risk factor for ACL tears. And so we're starting to see the pieces kind of fall into place that's really saying, hey, those that were multi-sport athletes actually have better coordination. They have better skill patterns, better things than those that were doing the single sport over and over and over again. So
Dr.
it's
Harris,
really, really interesting stuff.
Dr. Harris, how do you feel about children under the age of 14 who are being taught how to run properly? Do you feel like that should be more organically taught to oneself, or is it okay for them to take lessons about how to sprint, how to the biomechanics of running? I've spoken we were just with up in Boston at New Balance, working with some of the experts up there and some of the people in the track and field division, as well as the basketball division, were very much saying, you want to wait till you're in college before you start talking about conditioning coaches and biomechanic coaches. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting stuff. So, when we see kids in our clinic, obviously they're coming in because some sort of injury, so forth. And so most of the time, my general thought is I'm not going to sit here and try and change running form, over and over again. I do try and have it become a little bit more organic, unless there's something that I'm seeing that I really need to change because they're not going to be able to compete. Like if I'm seeing something that's definitely affecting their mechanics and so forth, and that's really creating the undue stress being placed on their knee, their ankle, whatever it is, I'm going to try and change that. But I'm not going to go say, well, your running form needs to be changed because you run funny, or that's not the way we run, or that's not the way we're teaching people to run, or teaching people. Your body tends to pick the most efficient manner that it can. Now, sometimes there are some things that are affected that it results in an inefficient manner, and that's where we kind of change and adjust some things. Sometimes it's just because the body's in that kind of peak growth phase and our body coordination is a little out of whack. Sometimes it's because they're a little bit tight in some of those areas. So those things sometimes are addressed that kind of evens out some of the form. So I'm not one of those people that's going to sit there and say, we absolutely need to change your running form. If it ain't broke, we're not going to fix it. There's no need to go start and fixing something if it's not really broken and or really affecting that. So I do like to try and have that go a little bit more organically. And
What
secondly,
about
I'm not the greatest track coach and in and of itself, so all the intricacies I'm not going to spend so much time on, right?
what about orthotics or arches that some parents are looking to do with their shoes for their kids?
Yeah, and that's conversations we have of, hey, these are some things that kind of mitigate some of the pain and things that you're having. Again, that's an easier fix than trying to change a kid's running form. And it's putting something in their shoe and discussing a stretch that they can do is probably going to be a lot more easier to receive, and the kids will be and families will be more compliant with it than me trying to adjust running form and trying to get that to change over time. Because especially for most of these kids, we're trying to change, if you try to change running form when they're 13, 14 years old, in 2 years, it's all going to be out of whack anyways, because they just grew another 2 inches and their body is completely off kilter, and it takes their body time to kind of get back into everything in the efficiency mode. So trying to change things too early in development is just not going to end very well, or you're just going to constantly keep doing it. So I try not to do it, especially in that early age.
Yep. Great, thank you.
And so, getting kind of back, and really the crux of this is we've really kind of pushed this idea of this long-term athletic development model, and that's really the kind of the model that we're really striving for. And so we've kind of learned some lessons, and we've said, hey, like these are the things we really need to adjust. And really the big things we've said is, you know what, Sports sampling is probably better than you know doing the same thing over and over again in sports specialization, especially at an earlier age. Now, we also say that year-round competition is probably not the best. Should be discouraged, especially in those younger athletes. But if I'm one of those people that if your child really loves baseball and they want to do baseball and that's what they love, I'm not going to tell you no. What I am going to tell you is, hey, you shouldn't be doing competitive baseball year round. That's number one. We can't be playing competitive baseball year round. What we can do is we can start to take a look at that skill development and working with different things and working on trying to find different ways to build skills that are going to help you later on. Now, that might be working with a hitting coach or whatever, but that hitting coach really needs to understand that there needs to be periods of rest, there needs to be time off, and the skill development has to be age appropriate, right? That's a key piece. Our training has to be age appropriate. Kids are not little adults. We need to understand, have some general sense of their typical development and take that into account when we're training these kids. And then we need to ensure that there's adequate rest throughout, right? So time off is absolutely essential to ensuring that these kids are being able to tolerate activities. So if they're going to play, year-round sports and they're going to do multiple sports, that's great. Make sure there's some time off built in their schedule. The general rule of thumb is no more hours per week than age and years, right? So an 8-year-old should be doing no more than 8 hours per week, and that's practice and any training and any competition, all that should probably be no more than 8 hours a week. And that's what their body really should be able to handle. And that's just kind of a general rule of thumb, but there's a little give and take there for sure. But really what we're trying to promote is this idea of long-term development. And the Canadian Sports Society basically has a great diagram. I have it listed there where they basically broke it down. And really, this is how we should be thinking about when we're training our athletes, that really they're not really competing and training to compete until they're about 15, 16 years old. And that's really when we should be really striving and pushing competition in the sense that we've typically doing earlier on now, where 10 and 12-year-olds are out there on a weekend tournament, and this weekend tournament is the biggest thing in the world, and we're doing a million different games, and then they're traveling the world, and soccer is number one, and we should be doing this. We've really kind of tried to push and shift that. And again, if kids love soccer, that's great, fantastic. I'm all supportive for that. I want you to be active, but it's just taking into account what are some adjustments that we can make in your schedule. What are some things that we can talk about to give your body enough rest, to make sure we're getting adequate sport development, adequate pediatric development, adequate sport development along the lines. And that's really where we're at.
This summary is fantastic. I love this chart. We're getting several questions, Doctor, and this has been an outstanding presentation. I think going back to this chart for a second, we wrap up, since a lot of parents are asking, they are asking right now, the level of athletic play encouraged for kids at different ages, starting as a toddler. And I think this chart says it all. This was one parent who just sent us this question. And if you could just go through these stages again, I think that would be really important.
Yeah. So when we talk about the younger kids, really, we talk about just getting them involved in the sport, right? So the sport really looks nothing like the typical sport that we see, right? And when we talk about soccer, they're not playing games at those early ages. They shouldn't be playing games. Really, the focus should be on skill development, right? That's what we're trying to teach them, the basics and understanding. And that should be in a fun environment. They should be playing some different games that's not necessarily with a soccer ball. It could be they're doing, some sort of running drills, red light, green light, all these different things where they're developing the listening skills, the start, stop, agility skills. These are all building blocks that are going to help them later in life. So when we look at sports at that younger age, that's what it's supposed to kind of look like, right? As we start to progress, you're starting to kind of fit more of the model of a practice, right? When you start to kind of get into later in grade school and middle school, that's when we would start to have more of a structured environment, right? Where we're seeing practice time, and practice still is going to look a little bit different. It's not highly competitive. We're just kind of going through, and we're still trying to work on skills, a lot of drills and things, but drills and games that are fun to keep them engaged is really what we're trying to do. And then when we start to kind of hit later in life, and then we're starting to hit in high school, that's when you're starting to see that level of competitive to go up. That's when we're starting to see the more heavy training. When we're talking about, practice, it's looking a lot like there's some drills and things early on, but then they're also going and doing scrimmaging. They're learning more about the game as it goes on, more the intricacies of the game, because they've had the skill development early on, right? They've learned the basic skills, they've learned the basic rules of the game early on, and now we can really focus on honing in those skills and really maximizing the development of those skills. And that's when we're starting to add different elements of strength training and plyometrics, and all that stuff really starts to hit at that level, because that's when they're really going to get the benefit out of it, compared to those younger kids who are not going to get as much of the benefit out of it.
Doctor, another great question. For children between, 8 and under, what sports would you recommend?
Honestly, anything. Like I love, recommending, and find a sport. There are so many more sport offerings now than when I was a kid. It's really amazing. It's fantastic. You know, the explosion of pickleball. Pickleball is great. It's a different activity. It's something, fun and engaging, right? There's a variety of different sports that are available. When I was a kid, we only had tackle football. Now there's flag football and so many levels of flag football. So there's so many sports available out there to us, and that's really a credit to the expansion of sports and everybody trying to get some sort of activity that they can do. And this push from the physical health benefits aspect of it, that you can go on and find so many different sports. I usually say, start with, the local parks and things like that, because they usually have what's kind of occurring there, and you can kind of see what sports are occurring. The traditional of, you want to basically mix it up as much as you possibly can, but obviously let your kids pick the sport, right? What do you want to play? What's the sport that you want to play, and really kind of start to go from there. Letting them pick is really going to help with their engagement, and what they want to do is really going to help sell what you're trying to kind of get. So I always say, let the kids pick. There's plenty of sports out there, and it doesn't have to be traditional sports either. Like, there's a lot of these things like ninja gyms and stuff like that, which is this non-traditional activity, but you're developing different muscle groups, you're developing different movement patterns. These things are great in the off season as a alternative to regular training. It's fun, it's different. You get to go out there with your friends, you're kind of running around. I would have loved that as a kid, to be perfectly honest. All we had was climbing on trees, right? Now they have actually gyms where you can climb all over stuff. So it's really great with the environment that we have right now.
I highly recommend karate and dance and gymnastics and parkour for young kids, because it you work on those flexibility muscles, plus it's just fun.
Yeah, yeah, it's great stuff out there, right?
Yeah. Another great question from a family. It asked about the uh, for soccer and lacrosse. This one particular parent said, I know that the pressure to specialize is earlier and earlier every year, like you mentioned. But what is the right age for soccer and lacrosse to specialize?
Short answer is, we don't know. So, my general, and what I try and tell families, is that ideally your specialization age is, at some point they are mature enough. They're kind of hitting that developmental stage. So we're looking generally kind of at, you know, 14, 15, 16. That's generally where I feel like specialization is probably that sweet spot of it, right? That's not to say that we can't do earlier. Like, there are some sports that have to specialize earlier. You talk about gymnastics. Gymnastics is one of those sports that they specialize a lot earlier. And that's just because they generally, the competition and the way it's all set up, that's, you need to, right? So I'm not saying that that's the right way to do things, but you know, it really comes down to, what do you feel and what are you trying to get out of it? What is your goal? Is your goal long-term athletic development, and to keep, your kid loves the sport and you want them to have an active lifestyle? Okay, then you can specialize, but just knowing that, right? if your goal is, well, we need to specialize because we need to be the most successful 14-year-old that possibly could be because we're hoping to get a scholarship, then that's probably not the reason to be specializing, and you want to delay that specialization a little bit more. So a lot of it is, what is the motive behind specialization? Is if you're trying to achieve early sports success, or you're trying to have this long-term athletic development. And if you're looking for the long-term athletic development, then you want to be doing it later in life.
So I'll ask a question. I've got three boys who are going through now basketball season. Tryouts have just happened, and they have, did not make the cut for the A team, now on the B team, and going through that process with them has been somewhat difficult because two of them are pretty resilient. The other one is really taking it hard, and I'm trying to enforce in them. It's not about winning or losing. It's about winning or learning. Winning and learning is all about, it doesn't matter if you lose. And because they're so young, they're under 11. And so I do see more and more sports today really trying to create that competitive nature, which in my opinion, it's pretty much in the DNA. What's your thoughts on that? Because I know for many parents, it's a crushing blow when these younger sports teams are making cuts and having A, B, and C teams.
Yeah, I can only imagine what your boys are going through. It's a tough thing, and I think thankfully a lot of these larger sports organizations have started to kind of realize that we do need A, B, and C, and even D teams, because you know what, we have to have these offerings for kids, right? It, just because you're on the B team doesn't mean you're second best, right? Everybody has different levels, and then it's hard to sell these kinds of conversations to kids because they live in the now, they don't live in the future, they don't, it's living in the present. So when I'm trying to explain to them, look, even though you're on the B team or whatever it is, you know what, you have a chance to continue to develop your skills, and you have a chance to continue to improve your skills and play a game that you love. And that's really what we should be focusing on. It's not you're competing at the high level. You still get to compete. You still get to have fun. Let's focus on that. I think it's definitely a tough conversation that kids feel like, because, well, I didn't make the top team, and it's tough on families too, because you know what, you put out so many dollars for these clubs and so forth, and if you're not making the top level, you're still paying a base salary that is whatever it is. So there's a lot of pressure that these kids feel, that I have to make the team. And really having the conversation with the child, look, I just want to go out and watch you have fun. If you love the sport, I want to watch you have fun playing that sport. I don't care what the competition looks like or what the future looks like. I just want to watch you have fun and do something that you love. And that's really the message that we try and kind of put around. And it's really one of the things that I try and push with my kids is like, hey, I just want to watch you have fun. I have fun watching you out there playing. That's enjoyable for me. Do I get a little competitive sometimes? Do I want to see you do well? Absolutely. But really the biggest joy that I have is, did you have fun playing? That's the first question I ask every time my son gets off the field. It's like, did you have fun playing? Great. That's number one, right? That's absolutely key.
Love it. Thank you for that. Another great question. This parent is asking for their multi-sport child. Tell me more about the time management that one should take in mind so that you can balance it all.
So I think parents these days have it hardest more than anything, trying to balance kids' sports schedules and everything that's involved with that. And then trying to mitigate, well, are we doing too much, and keeping it all track and getting from A to B, and all those things fall in. So I love the hours per week, based on years, is a great rule and is a great baseline. But like I said, there is some wiggle room when it comes to that. Really, what you need to take a look at is, what does the training look like? Are we talking about a lot of intensive training, or is it a lot of practices, games? How much downtime are you having? So that hour per week is really a good starting point, and then you really have to kind of look at what you're doing. And then, obviously, are the kids enjoying it? Are we getting a lot of overlap? And then, if they're playing multiple sports, take into account, are they playing a flag football game on Saturday morning, and then they have a basketball game later in that day? Is there adequate rest built into their schedule, or is everything loaded in like 3 days of the week on the weekend? And are we doing a lot of those hours? That's still a lot. Yeah, they have a lot of days rest, but there's not a lot of rest in between those hours. And I know you can't necessarily dictate what the schedule is going to be, and the way organizations put out their schedules and everything, there's a limitation on fields, there's a limitation on space, and everything kind of has to fit in, and they can't necessarily think about everything when it comes to the athlete's safety and everything in mind. And that's really where parents just kind of having a general understanding of, okay, how much are we doing? Do we need to cut back? Do we really need to be at this practice? Is there something that we can kind of cut back to make sure we're just being able to continue to go and be able to do the things that that my child wants to be able to do? And so really taking a look at that schedule of, what does the schedule look like, and what does the intensity of the schedule look like? And is there something that I can try and adjust? Is there an opportunity that I can move something to allow for a little bit more time, rest time, sufficient, rest in between activities? Or are we kind of saying go, go, go? And that's really where it gets really, really hard, especially when we're doing these tournaments and the families are traveling and things like that. There's so many things involved when it comes to sports scheduling. I am not envious of parents whatsoever when it comes to that aspect.
Well, I think I just heard you though say something. There's a ceiling, right? There's a max, and you're saying for every year of that child, if they're 10 years old, 10 hours max per week. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean that's the general rule of thumb, and like I said, there's give and take a couple hours here and there. Like I said, if it's, you say, well, my 10-year-old's doing 13 hours, but really, their practices are a little bit more structured and it's literally skill based, and they're not doing a lot of highly competitive and intensive like scrimmaging and things like that, but it's more so learning the skills, and there's a lot of downtime in that. Then that 13 hours is probably okay, right? But if you're doing 10 hours of intensive training and they're constantly, we're strength training, we're running, we're doing sprinting, like that's probably a little too much. And we need to kind of back that off, because there's just not. And especially if that 10 hours is over the course of 3 days, that's a little bit too much for our body to handle.
Right. Another question came from a parent who's got a rising little leaguer who loves to pitch. How much is too much pitching in one game for a child?
Depends upon the age of the child. USA Baseball and Little League Baseball have great resources when it comes to pitch counts. So they are fantastic resources. I would highly recommend going there. I think off the top of my head, and I don't know the numbers, but generally speaking, it's broken down in days of rest. So really the max pitches that like an 8-year-old or 9-year-old, I think is like, I think it's probably like 80 or 90, somewhere in there is the amount of pitches that they can throw. But that number goes down depending upon how many days of rest they have in between. So 5 days of rest in between, 5 days in between their pitching, they can do 90 and 90, right? Anything less than, I think it's like you do 20 pitches if it's you're going to pitch the next day, right? 1 day of rest in between or so forth. So they have really, really adopted this concept of, hey, we need to limit this. And a lot of that has come because there was nothing for years. And we really started to see this trend of, what's happening with kids' arms? What's happening? Why are these kids so exhausted and so tired? Why are we seeing so many injuries and so forth? And really, we took a look. Well, we're pitching a lot. And really that pitching was, well, kids aren't just playing Little League anymore. They're playing Little League and travel ball. And then, oh, by the way, they have a pitching coach. And so we add all that together, and that's really the number that you really need to look at. So a lot of the times the Little League coach is focused on what their Little Leaguer is doing, but he doesn't realize that that kid is also doing a pitching coach during the week, and he's also on another baseball team, and those things come into account. And that's really where parents need to have an understanding of that. So yes, Little League does a great job of teaching the coaches of these things, but it's parents understanding that there's a number too, and that number is a sum of total throws. It's not just, oh, throws for this team, it's a sum of total throws, and we really need to look at that.
And Doctor, just in the last 60 seconds, we've had multiple comments, which is really great. You've really hit on something. I just want you to clarify something. And that is, if they're 10 years old and that 10 is that ceiling, like you mentioned, again, beware, you don't do that 10 hours throughout the year for that one sport, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously there should be some, a little bit more of a down period, really, realistically, what we would love to see, and I'll use baseball as an example, right? So you typically have your fall ball, which is a little less competitive. You're working on some more skill development. Then usually in the winter, that's when most of these kids are going in, working with a personal coach or so forth, and like that. That intensity shouldn't be that high, and usually your volume during that time isn't that high, right? That's really where you're working on that skill development and really kind of honing in those skills. And then you start to hit the little league season or spring and summer baseball season. That's probably where your intensity is a little bit higher. And that's where you would just want to keep an eye on it, right? And so again, that rule is not a set rule that if you hit 10 hours, I need to stop my child from playing. Just use it as a guideline and really use that and take a look at how much are we doing? Are we doing too much? Does my child look like he's doing too much? Is he getting tired? Is he complaining about being sore the next day a lot? And are we just doing too much here? And then we can use that as a guideline to help us really make a decision as a family of, hey, what's best? Talk to the athlete. Hey, how do you feel out there? Do you feel tired? Do you feel like you can keep going? And those conversations can happen between kids and parents and make that decision ultimately.
Fantastic. Besides the chart that you showed and your recommendations on, kind of there's a ceiling of the amount of hours per week in participation in a sport, and your recommendations on, multi-sports is really the way to go. Can you give any other tips for parents? Because we've gotten several questions about how to reduce the risk of injury as a young athlete.
Yeah. Um, Stretching is great. We don't do enough of it. Especially during those peak growth years. Really, really, really important. Just develop good stretching habits. We've come a long way. I would say, since I've started practicing PT, that we've gotten a lot better about doing warm-ups and proper warm-ups, and those are really greatly standardized. You want to see these kids take those warm-ups seriously, which sometimes doesn't happen, especially at the younger levels. But those are super important things, right? Doing a good warm-up prior to doing activity can go a long way. Making sure there's adequate rest built in their schedule is absolutely key, because I talked about an overuse injury happens because the load is way too much and there's not enough rest period for your tissue to adapt, right? So we can increase the load and have a high load as long as there's time for the tissue to adapt to that. That allows our body to adapt, and that's how we actually gain strength, right? We actually gain strength and gain muscle actually by breaking down some of that muscle and straining ourselves and kicking ourselves up just a little bit beyond where we should be. And then we have that time to repair. And that's actually how we continue to get these strength gains. But there's a ceiling that you go a little bit too much, and that's really where we have. And then there's no rest on top of that. That's really kind of the issue that we says. And then really listening to your body, and I tell kids, be an advocate for yourself out there, right? There's a lot of social pressures, from coaches, parents, from teammates, from themselves, right? You don't have to be the star. If your arm's hurting and on that throw you really hurt your arm and it's not really feeling too good and you're not feeling good out on the mound there, talk to your coach. I'm going to tell you, they're not going to be upset that you're pulling yourself out, right? They may, but I guarantee that over time it'll be fine, and in the long run it's going to be better for you. But that's hard for an 11-year-old, 10-year-old, even for 15, 16-year-olds to do, right? To take that ownership and say, hey, I can't go. My arm is dead. I can't do anymore. That's a tough thing. So really having those conversations with your child early on of, hey, empower yourself. I'm going to support you with how you feel. And if you make that decision, I'm going to stand behind you, and I'm going to be right behind you when you're talking to the coach and having that conversation. Because if you're telling me that you're not feeling it, then I know that that's the point we got to stop, right?
Fantastic. Doctor, one last question. What's your recommendations on resistance training or even strength training without weights for 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds? And should they wait? Should that parent wait when puberty kind of dictates that guidance or not?
Yeah, so you would think that, okay, well, if they're not going to gain any strength, then I shouldn't do any strength training when they're younger. And the answer is, well, no, because when we talked about it, that neurodevelopment, so yeah, no weights is okay, and even some light resistance is okay. But if you're actually teaching them the proper weightlifting movements and teaching them how to move correctly, that when they do hit that point of puberty and they're actually able to gain that muscle mass, they are going to be safe doing it, right? So weight training and strength training and all that thing early on is okay. And, mostly what we look for is, can the kids follow instructions, right? Can they listen? Are they going to be running around the gym like crazy? Probably not a good idea, right? So you want to make sure they're able to follow instructions, understand they have some sense of how their body moves. If they have those things, then by all means, you can start strength training with kids so that they start to learn the correct movement patterns. If those things aren't in place, you maybe want to wait a little bit, but that's not to say that you can't do those things early on with those kids. The gains are just going to be different. You're going to get more of that neural muscular gain as opposed to that hypertrophy or muscle mass gain.
Right. Dr. Harris, this has been fantastic tonight. Incredibly worth every second. You're a man of great wisdom, and I want to have parents refer to the kidshealth.org site for any questions or any type of top-notch, wisdom from the great doctors from Nemours. You can also go onto the Aspen Institute site at aspeninstitute.org under their issues and health under the sport piece. And then there's a great website to reference the Stop Injuries website at www.ncyS.org/safety for you to gain some great information. But nemours.org and kidshealth.org has everything there for families to use for great guidance and any information or tips you may need. But Dr. Harris, I want to thank you tonight and all the great
Thank you.
people at Nemours for what you do for all of our kids and all of our families. And thank you so much again for participating.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thanks again for tuning in, and we look forward to our next webinar with the great people at Nemours. Thanks so much, and have a great evening. Take care.